I got absolutely destroyed by this book, and I am so glad I did. But before I get to that, hey, my name is Frank. Welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things bookish. So we've got a bit of a longer video today where I'm going to be discussing Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. So I'm just going to go ahead and throw up a really quick synopsis of what this book is about. Again, most of my reviews are done under the assumption that you have already read the book, and that if you haven't, you don't care about spoilers and you don't care about being confused as to what I'm talking about. So pause to read if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and give all of the trigger warnings right off the bat. There is going to be discussion of murder, suicide, sexual violence, and other things of that nature. I try not to get too explicit about these things in this video, but there are more than a few mentions of it. So if these are things that are triggering for you, I do have other reviews that are more lighthearted that you can go check out instead. The last thing I want to say before we get into it is that this is the first time that I have decided to script my video as I was reading the book. So part one is more of a chapter by chapter basis. By part two, I got a little bit lazy with it and was kind of going in every couple of chapters to write my thoughts down. And then by part three, I just completely threw that idea out of the window and I just powered through and read the whole part three in one sitting because I was so enthralled with this book that I did not want to put it down to write my thoughts. So without further ado, let's get into it. So in the prologue, we are immediately thrown into the action of getting Loretta Thurwar's origin story of how she came to be this grand colossal. We see her first fight ever up against Melancholia Bishop, who at the time is a crowd favorite. This is her last fight before she becomes High Freed. And obviously, we don't know who we're rooting for yet. And the interesting thing is that title kind of struck me as a bit strange because in this universe, in this near future dystopian society during this chain gang sport, becoming freed is usually when one of the links is able to attain freedom after performing for 3 years on the circuit and surviving all of their bouts and fights. So obviously, based on the title, you're assuming that Melancholia is going to win this fight. That's not the case. Later on in the book, we learn the difference between being high freed and low freed. So obviously being high freed is when you do successfully make it through 3 years on the circuit. And then low freed is when you are killed during battle or sometime on your, during your time on the circuit. And that is another sense of freedom, I suppose. So Melancholia becomes low freed by Thurwar, and that, I mean, as far as prologues go, man, that was like jumping straight into the action like that. I am interested. I'm hooked. I'm intrigued by what we're going to find out. I think in a book like this, being thrown directly into the action is one of the best ways to get a reader interested in the story. Now, Melancholia does say something to Loretta during their fight, kind of low enough so that the cameras can't really hear her. And she's talking about kind of how tired she is. She mentions that a couple times about she's just so tired. And after getting further in the book, I realized that this kind of meant that even if she had managed to win her fight against Thurwar and become High Freed, she was never going to be able to assimilate back into society in a way that would have given her a true sense of freedom. Obviously, the things that she has had to do in those 3 years surviving on the circuit would probably haunt her and literally anybody else for the rest of their lives. Nobody's ever going to be able to escape that trauma of that. And one of the main reasons why I thought this, especially so early on in the book before that idea kind of becomes confirmed through like Sunset Harkless's character and through some of the other characters who have fought during this circuit, is early on in the book, both Loretta and Stax are kind of described as having those similar feelings already. The dread and the guilt are very evident in these characters, along with feelings of excitement and pride at being the center of attention of all of these thousands and thousands of people that are in the seats at these stadiums that are, screaming their names. And I feel like Adjei-Brenyah does such an amazing job at kind of exposing the reader to all of the complex and nuanced emotions that someone might actually feel if they were to be put in these positions. This idea of, like, obviously guilt and horror and trauma of murdering and killing these other people, and at the same time being supported so openly by so many people for doing it. Adjei-Brenyah talks about that energy that you can feel in the stadium, this like tangible almost current of electricity that is coursing through everybody. We see this a few times in both Loretta and Stax's chapters. We even see this at some point with Marie or slash Marissa, who is Sunset Harkless's daughter, where she is actually talking about, right before she like crosses the barrier and runs into the middle of the stadium to hold up her sign and stuff like that. She is also talking about this surge of energy and electricity that is just coursing through the stadium, that you can feel it. It's palpable. And I feel like Adjei-Brenyah, really, one of his strengths in this book is actually getting the reader to feel the emotions, no matter how complex and nuanced of each character, right? Because another one of my favorite things about this book is that it is told through third omniscient point of view. And if you have seen any of my other videos, you know how much I fucking love a good third omniscient. I believe it is one of the best storytelling devices, especially for a story like this, to be able to kind of float around as this like non-corporeal entity where we get to see not only different characters and different venues and facets of their life, but we get to get inside of their minds. That is one of the best part about third omniscient, is you are not just tied to one or two characters points of view and get access to their internal world and thoughts and landscape, but you get this from almost every single character whose point of view you come across. And Adjei-Brenyah did a phenomenal job with this. We get so many different character POVs, and we also get to see how they're feeling and what they're thinking and why they are thinking it. We get to experience events that other characters don't know about, or that haven't happened yet, or that happened way in the past. And I think third omniscient was a very strong and solid choice as a storytelling method for this book. Now, another strong choice was the footnotes at the end of these chapters that kind of bring the reader to understand how and why some of these characters ended up in the position that they did, especially characters that don't get a lot of like screen time, we'll call it, a lot of maybe characters that don't really even get their own chapter POVs and stuff like that. So for instance, in Barry's case, we learn in one of the footnotes that he had woken up with his arm wrapped around one of his friends, and theoretically in a drunken rage, he had killed his friend. We never find out if that was actually true or not. It's just what is alluded to because he doesn't know, and all the cops knew was that he was holding on to a dead body. So like, now, regarding footnotes, we also get like Teacup's explanation of kind of how he killed his mother and father. And then Mickey Wright, who is the announcer for these games for the sport, he makes a comment about how Teacup is probably the youngest person to ever be killed by the state, by the US government. And it's worth noting that in this book, theoretically, because these are prisoners and because they're property of the state, that when one of them kills another, it is technically, like legally, it is the state killing them through like the death penalty. But in this specific example, Adjei-Brenyah uses a real statistic and a real anecdotal case about George Stinney Jr. actually being the youngest person in the history of the United States to ever be killed with the death penalty by the state. And we learned that, 70 years after he was killed, he was actually exonerated for this alleged crime. Adjei-Brenyah then proceeds to include another statistic about how since the year 1973, approximately 186 people have been wrongly convicted and sentenced to death by the government. I really appreciated that Adjei-Brenyah took this opportunity to educate his audience about real world violence from the state and how it has disproportionately affected the Black community. Now, one of the main reasons why I really did enjoy these footnotes is that it gives the reader not only the opportunity to learn these things that maybe they didn't know before, but also to give actual real world, real life context to this fictional world and how it came to be, all while ensuring that we as the reader are not entirely removed from the story. Because Adjei-Brenyah could have included these in the actual structure of the chapter itself, but by including them at the end of the chapter, I think Adjei-Brenyah did an amazing job at blending fiction with reality. A lot of people felt like these footnotes at the end with these statistics and everything like that. Some of the critiques I saw were that people wished that at that point he could have just actually written a nonfiction book about these issues, about the penal system, and that including them in a story of fiction almost removed this element of fiction. And I think that was kind of the point. By illustrating that we are not so far removed from this fictional dystopian world. This is almost like a plausible understanding of how things can manifest. This is almost like an exaggerated version of events that happen now. The violence that occurs in the story it's not anything that people have not been forced to do or that we have normalized in our society. We have such a punitive mindset. We have come to, I say we, the general public, okay? We have come to normalize the dehumanization of prisoners. We have come to normalize punitive actions and measures. And in a book, a dystopian sci-fi novel that is critiquing the penal system, the carceral system, the private prisons, and this punitive mentality that people have, I think that relating it to the real world and real violence not only was the correct choice, but it highlighted the very thing that Adjei-Brenyah was trying to get across, which is that you and I, you and me, we're part of this now. We normalize these things now. We have created a culture in which this story, not that hard to fathom, right? And I think a lot of people didn't like that. When they read dystopian sci-fi, they like to have an element of being able to remove themselves from the reality. Star Wars and stuff like that, fighting in space and whatever else. They like to have this element of being far enough removed from the violence that occurs in these things. And I think this book made a point to ensure that there was no way that we as the reader could remove ourselves from it, that we had to sit and stew in the discomfort, in the anguish and the process of dehumanizing these prisoners. And I think that was very well done. There were so many moments in this book that I was physically sick to my stomach reading what these characters were going through. And I'll get more into depth about specific examples of that, but Simon J. Kraft was a very prominent example in my mind, the torture that this man went through. And I'll get into it. I just got to keep on moving because I've gone way off script at this point. So something outside of these internal struggles of all of these characters that kind of kept me pushing to read through the story was the very early insertion of this murder mystery plot that we get introduced to of Sunset Harkless's character. Right, he was a very good friend to Loretta Thurwar, who is one of our main characters, and we learned very, very like first couple of chapters that he was murdered by somebody. We don't know why, we don't know by who, and by inserting this murder mystery so early on in the story, it was just one more thing to keep me tethered and keep me interested in wanting to continue reading this. So we eventually get to the point where Loretta Thurwar has just finished her fight with Teacup, and she is being walked by the guards back to the van to wait for all of the other links. And as she's doing so, she gets a note from a woman that she does not know, she does not recognize, but something in her like recognizes, like everybody else that's there, all these other fans, they're screaming and they're, hooting and hollering and they're like trying to get Thurwar's attention. But this woman in the crowd grabs her attention for some reason. There's something very earnest about this woman that causes Loretta to actually kind of pay attention to her. And at this time, this woman manages to give Loretta a note in her hand without anybody else really being able to realize it. So Thurwar gets to the van. She's the first one in there. So she has the opportunity to read this note without anybody else witnessing it. And we don't get to know what the note says, but by the time she's finished reading it, she is very distraught. She's crying. She's very sad. And the only context that we know about this note is that it has something to do with the next season of the Chain Gang All Stars sport. Now, at this point, because of just pattern recognition and things like that, I was assuming that it was going to have something to do with links having to fight other links from their own chain. My reasoning for thinking this was that Adjei-Brenyah had left us like this little breadcrumb of foreshadowing a little bit earlier in the book, like 1 or 2 chapters before this point, where Thurwar and Stax, who are in a relationship with one another, we do learn that. He kind of like foreshadows this moment with both of them making a joke that the other one is very lucky that they're on the same chain because otherwise they'd have to fight each other. They both kind of make that joke to one another. And it's a little bit, I don't want to say obvious because, again, this is early on in the book. So if you're not really paying attention, it was an easy thing to kind of miss. Like you would almost just kind of chalk it up to a bit of banter between these two main characters. But again, pattern recognition and all this stuff, it kind of had me thinking like, oh, they're going to have to fight each other. Right. In part 1, I found Hendrix Young's chapter to be very poignant, very disturbing, very like punch you in the gut with everything that he's kind of going through because this is our first introduction to this character. Like I said, Adjei-Brenyah does move between different points of view throughout the book and pretty frequently too. You don't get more than 1 or 2 chapters from a singular character in a row very often. Usually it's bouncing from one character's POV to the next, to the next, to the next. And I enjoyed this because it kind of was giving me a very like rounded out understanding of how this story was progressing. Some people who criticized this book for that very reason felt like it was very disjointed and very hard to follow along what was happening. You kind of were getting like kind of ripped out from like the transition they didn't think was very smooth. And I think there is a little bit of credit to that critique. I think while I enjoyed the storytelling device of Third Omniscient, I do think that we could have spent a little more time, like maybe if it had changed POV every 2 to 3 chapters for each character. But again, not every character gets an equal amount of time in this narrative. Emily, who is one of the characters, she's like married to this guy who's like super obsessed with the sport named Will. Will gets 1 chapter. Emily gets 2 chapters throughout the whole book. Whereas Loretta and Stax get, I didn't count how many they got. They got a bulk of the book because they are the main characters. So I kind of almost understand why Adjei-Brenyah decided to kind of transition pretty abruptly from one character to another. But again, I do think there is a little bit of merit to that critique that it was rather abrupt. Now, back to Hendrix Young's first chapter. Again, we get a footnote around this time where Adjei-Brenyah includes the 13th Amendment that basically kept slavery legal just under the guise of ensuring that it was a punishment. So in case you didn't know, the prison system is basically slavery. They don't have any rights. They are forced to work with with no pay. I think they get paid like fucking 12 cents an hour or something like that. That's not making money. That's not, and that's the way that legally they justify it as not being slavery, because technically they're getting paid for their labor, but dog shit. I mean, I don't know the exact number of how much money they get paid per hour, but I do know it's not a lot. So I did enjoy this footnote. I felt like it was very important regarding the story where we're talking about a world that has this, neo-slavery. And he also references the Auburn system, which was a real life experimental program that kept prisoners silent 24/7 in order to remove their sense of self and dehumanize them. It made them a lot more complacent and very disturbing to think about, because we see the mental effects that it has on someone like Hendrix Young, where in this first chapter where we're learning about his character, the sentence structure is very abrupt, very almost like singular in the way that it is constructed, because a lot of the sentences were short and to the point. It almost felt like because Hendrix Young had gone so long without using his voice, he almost forgot how to speak. Have you ever seen that episode of The Office where Kevin is like,
so me think, why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
like the sentence structure kind of felt like that. I'm not calling Hendrix Young stupid or anything, but it did feel very much like he was just trying, like, we're in his mind, but he's still just trying to get to the point, It's like he only recalled enough language to be able to articulate the most basic of concepts and ideas in a way that still provided a very visceral and real and almost like magnetic energy as to what he was saying, because he's talking about cutting up bodies. This is a meat processing plant that he and the other prisoners of this facility work at. It's so raw. I'm gonna read you a segment really quick. Now I'm gonna put it up on the screen because this almost feels like poetry, the way that it is written. So here we go. It says, "We work. My life is work. I pray for work. I hate my work. I need my work. I pull/push meat for the buzzing saws. I have the body. The saw eats gladly. Two halves a body. I have a body. I have a body. I do the same. I do the same." Now, this quote in particular to me represents the dehumanization of the inmates in this prison. They exist solely to work. They have been stripped of all purpose outside of their work. This is evidenced not only by the fact that they are not able to use their voices, but also by these wrist cuffs that keep them physically binded to the immediate space that they are occupying. They are unable to speak, unable to move, only able to work. Now, this brings me to the end of Hendrix Young's first chapter, and it ends with a representative from the CAPE program trying to get him to sign the initial paperwork to join the Chain Gang All-Stars sport. While he is in the hospital, he was trying to help this old man that was like swaying and about to fall and could have like hurt himself because they're working around all these meat processing saws and stuff like that. So by trying to help this old man, he ends up getting his arm sawed right off. And now he's in the hospital and he's a little bit delirious from coming out of anesthesia and being able to sing and like speak, use his voice, because while they are in the hospital wing of the prison or whatever it is, they do not have them on silent mode. They allow them to make noise because a lot of the time they're in a lot of pain. They're going to be screaming. So they have found it a lot easier to just allow them to have the freedom to use their voice for that reason. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, so the whole thing is like now that he has his arm sawed off and he would probably not be able to work in the meat processing plant anymore, they sent down a representative from the CAPE program to basically kind of almost coerce him into joining. This is again the initial paperwork. Later on in the book, he is meeting with the warden of the prison as well as a few other representatives, both from the government and the CAPE program. in order to really sign the paperwork where he's not being coerced. But again, I do consider this coercion because, I mean, come on. Like, dude just got his arm sawed off. Like, you're asking him to sign this initial paperwork now. That is coercion, point blank, period. And I would argue that every single person who was participating in this sport was coerced into doing so. Because if your options are to spend 25 years completely silent, or in any of these other experimental prisons where they're torturing you every fucking day, or take your chances out on a circuit and try to survive 3 years, or at the very least get killed in a quick moment, is it really a choice? Now, I know I just talked about how Hendrix Young doesn't have a voice in this, in the chapter that we meet him, right? But Adjei-Brenyah does have a very unique talent for giving all of these characters their own distinct voices. Each character has a different way of speaking that informs the reader whose chapter we're reading, right? We can almost guess who it is before we are actually shown who is speaking or who we're speaking to or about, because Adjei-Brenyah is able to give each character their own distinct way of speaking. And I think that is incredible when you are talking about so many different characters. Like I said, I mentioned Emily and Will, and then obviously we have Loretta, we have Hendrix, we have Simon J. Kraft, we have Stax. One chapter is from Patricia St. John, who I will talk about a little bit later on. We have chapters from, did I already say Mitchell? I mean, God, there's so many characters that we get their perspective and their point of view. Sometimes it's only for one chapter or two chapters, but still in that time, we are able to understand their distinct voice. And I think that speaks to some very incredible writing, very talented. Every character has their own way of comprehending and relating to the world around them, despite going through such similar experiences of dehumanization or being the one on the other side, dehumanizing the others. So we see this, like I said, with Hendrix's character. We see this with Loretta. We see this with Stax and pretty much every single one of the prisoners who is participating in these games. But we also see this with characters like Niall, who is in love with Marissa. We see this with Marissa. We see this with her aunt, Kai. We see this with Jerry, the van driver. We see this with Mitchell, who was the guy who came up with the blood points, and I'll talk about him in a little bit. We see this with Lucas, or Luke, or something like that, who is the son of the guy who owns all these private prisons, and they're on the board of the chain gang sport to determine the rules and everything like that. We see this with so many different characters that it's like an ecosystem of oppression and dehumanization. Each character plays a role in this ecosystem. And it's funny because later on in the book, Adjei-Brenyah does use the word ecosystem itself when we're reading Mitchell's chapter, and I will talk about that. But when I wrote this note of an ecosystem, I had not read that part yet. This was like something that I had considered because each character does play a part in the way that this whole game and society is structured. Not all of them are playing a willing role or an equal role necessarily, but none of these roles can exist without the other. And this brings me to something I wanted to talk about because I saw a lot of criticisms from people who have my complexion, who look like me, who are white, who were kind of talking about like how they didn't appreciate being beaten over the head with the core themes and messaging of this novel, which is obviously abolitionism. Is that a word? Abolition, and kind of like the evils of the private prison industrial complex. I feel like that was really only one part of what Adjei-Brenyah was trying to get at. The interesting thing is that a lot of the people who were criticizing the core themes being beaten over our heads with all of these footnotes, and the fact that Adjei-Brenyah was not subtle at all with what he was trying to say regarding that, with regarding abolition. And in the same breath, they talk about how they did not enjoy the storytelling device of seeing different characters' POVs and that it felt very disjointed. And I think those two critiques side by side with one another kind of signifies that another core message that has been completely disregarded by a lot of the people who have read this book who didn't like it is that we are being introduced to all of these characters because, like I said, we are meant to see how each and every single one of these characters in their own way is participating in this system. If there was nobody like Will and Emily to view it and to pay for seeing these fights and getting to these stadiums and stuff like that, then the people at the very top wouldn't be making any money. And if they weren't making any money, then they wouldn't have any incentive to ensure that these games continued or that the rules for these games are as cruel as they are. And if they didn't have that, then these prisoners wouldn't even be in the position to have to decide whether or not they want to spend 25 years being tortured in these weird experimental prisons or having to fight for their life. This is an ecosystem. Everybody participates in some way, and none of them can exist without the other. That speaks to something that Adjei-Brenyah was trying to get across, is that we do the very same thing in the here and now. The systems that exist, even though we are not all equal and willing participants, they could not be sustained if we were not all, to some extent, to some capacity, participating in these systems. And I think that core message really did get lost with a lot of people, both people who enjoyed it, but especially the people who were criticizing the idea of being shown all of these different points of view and feeling very disjointed. So again, you can't argue that you don't like a storytelling method and that you're being beaten over the head with the themes and the messages of this book, and then you completely neglect to understand and appreciate one of the most important parts of this book. At least that's what I think. That's how I feel about it. So anyway, the story moves on to one of Emily's chapters, who again is the wife of that Will character who is like obsessed with this sport. And we learn that she's actually more of a fan of the Link Life program, which is kind of like the reality television portion of the sport, where when these links are not actually fighting each other on the battleground, they are participating in marches, which is essentially they get dropped off in the middle of fucking nowhere by a van, and then they have to walk for hours or days to their next town, their next battleground or whatever. They have camps that are set up for them every night, where once they reach the camp, they are allowed to kind of like roam a little, not free, but they do get a little bit more length on their leash. And food is kind of dropped off for them. They have tents and blah, blah, blah. So this is the part that Emily is really interested in, is the almost the psychological portion of these links behind the scenes kind of thing. She considers herself someone who is more interested in the social component of the sport as opposed to the fighting portion of the sport. And so in this chapter, she turns on the TV, and within the chapter, it cuts to the perspective of some of the links on the Angola Hammond chain, which is where Thurwar and Stax, that's their chain that they're on. In the scene, they are marching toward their campground. So the night progresses, everybody gets their meal, they're all kind of sitting down. Stax is asking Thurwar, she's like, you have to do it now, you have to do it now. Like, we don't know what she's talking about, so we're led to believe that they have had a conversation about what Stax wants Loretta to say to the rest of the chain, because Loretta is kind of like their leader kind of thing. And so Stax is like, you need to do it now. And Loretta's like reluctant about it, but she's like, okay, fine. So Loretta gets out there. She tells everybody on her chain, she's like, from this point forward, we do not hurt each other. We are family. I will not tolerate anything else. And everybody's just kind of like, okay, whatever. So then Stax uses this opportunity to be like, oh yeah, by the way, I was actually the one that killed Sunset Harkless. And then the chapter ends right there, or like flashes back to Emily's perspective, because remember, Emily is watching this on the TV, and it ends with basically with Emily being like, holy shit, which was exactly what I said. I literally said that. I was like, holy shit. I literally almost threw my Kobo across the room, because what the hell, because we don't find out why. She doesn't say why she did it. Everybody's like, what? And we're also like, what? Like, why? So yeah, that was like such a holy shit moment. And Adjei-Brenyah really knows how to provide tension in this book. So after that, the next chapter, you're hoping like you're gonna get some answers from Stax as to why she killed him. Nope, we move to Tracy Lasser's chapter. And she was actually an old schoolmate of Stax's, of Hamura Stax, right? She's like making her debut as a sportscaster on one of the most watched news sports segments in the world. And her anxiety is tangible. She is very nervous, which you are led to believe that's obviously a pretty normal thing, right? You're about to be on the worldwide news for the first time. Who wouldn't be nervous? But when she's sitting in front of the camera, it's finally rolling, it's finally her time to speak. She's making her introduction because again, she's a new newscaster. And as she's doing it, she just drops this huge fucking bomb. She goes into this whole monologue about what a disgrace sportscasting has become and that she is against B3 and she's calling for its repealment, and how this news program is basically airing murder on their screens and murder, lynching, death, all of this, and that's not a sport. And then she proceeds to do this like badass walk off moment where she's like, she just dropped this whole bomb and then just like walks off like the bad bitch that she is. And on her way out of the studio, her male co-anchor who has been hitting on her and like kind of super icky, like sexually harassing her and all this stuff. He's like, what the heck just happened? And, she turns around, she's like, you know what? And you can fuck off. And of course, how can you not love Tracy after that chapter? Between the chapter ending with Stax admitting that she killed Sunset and then this next chapter with Tracy back to back, there was so much tension. And that is something that Adjei-Brenyah really does have a talent for, is creating tension in these short bursts, in these short scenes. And from what I understand, this was actually his debut, like full length novel. Prior to that, he had released a collection of short stories, which I have not read. But from what I understand, he's a very talented writer in the short story world. Like he's able to convey a lot of information in a very short amount of time. I felt very similar about this book. I think it also kind of clarifies why he decided to go back and forth between all these different perspectives, because it allowed him to play to his strengths as a writer, which is being able to create a lot of tension, a lot of chaos, a lot of drama, a lot of emotion in a very short, punchy amount of time. And I felt that way the whole, like I said, this book, I felt sick to my stomach reading through a lot of this. So eventually after this, we get back to camp and we witness Thurwar and Stax kind of exchanging these cryptic messages to each other, because again, they're being followed around by these like floating cameras all of the time. They are being surveilled 24/7. They do not have a moment of peace. There are literally thousands of people watching them at all times. So they can't just come out and say what they need to say to each other. So they have developed this, we're led to believe that they have developed this weird, like cryptic, secretive language that really only the two of them can understand. And during this time, I believe this is Thurwar's perspective, like this is her chapter that we're reading from, if I remember correctly. And at this time, we do finally get it confirmed that the note that Marissa had passed off to Thurwar when she was getting in the van did actually say what we had feared was true, which is that the beginning of season 33 for this sport, Loretta and Stax are going to be forced to fight each other. Now, like I said, I kind of like the foreshadowing kind of hinted to this, so I wasn't really surprised when we did get to this moment where we discovered this, but I was still heartbroken nonetheless. It was still pretty upsetting to see that it was going to happen. And of course, the whole time from the point that we get this confirmed to the end of the book, we're hoping that something changes. We're hoping that something comes into play that is going to save them from having to do this. Now, around this time, Stax is kind of, she's not really explaining to Thurwar why she killed Sunset. She just is like, oh, I had to do it. I'm sorry. And Obviously, like, as a nosy bitch, I was really annoyed at this because I wanted to know why she did it. And so it was a little frustrating. I mean, I get why, and eventually we do learn why, but in this moment, I was like, well, goddamn, like, just tell us. But she couldn't because, again, these floating cameras were hovering around. She didn't want to be open and honest with Third War while there were so many viewers. So around this time, we also kind of like from Third War's perspective, she is under the assumption that Stax had something to do with orchestrating this fake fight between Rico and Sai I hope is that what Sai I think that's what their name is, or like how they you pronounce their stage name, right? Anyway, so Third War is like getting really suspicious, which was making me suspicious. I was like, wait a second, is Stax like about to betray Third War? Like, what's happening? But obviously, like, Third War is like, you know what? I'm just gonna trust her because I love her. And you're like, okay, Third War. If Third War is trusting Stax, I trust Stax, right? But there was a part of me that was like, oh my god, is Stax going to betray Third War? Like, why is she doing all this? You know, she killed Sunset, and now she's like theoretically orchestrating this fake fight between I and Rico Morte. So, like, what's up with that? So, part one concludes with another one of Emily's chapters, and again, most of this chapter felt like a bit of foreshadowing to me because they kind of discuss how there should be instability theoretically between the links on the Angola Hammond chain because Sunset had been murdered by Stax, and there's all this secretive crap going on, and how that would create a lot of instability for any other chain. But Will is like, you know what? Not with them. They're solid. They're the best of the best for a reason. And the chapter ends with Will getting excited to show Emily how Third War kind of rose up in the ranks from the sport because he, again, he has access to all the footage and all the fights and the bouts of the last however many years. So he's like super excited to talk to his wife and be like, hey, like, check this out. Like, because anyway, I didn't like Will. So yeah, that was part one. So in part two, we get a bit more of Simon J. Kraft's perspective. He is the Link who basically went absolutely insane from being influenced so much by that one prison guard. And the to be influenced chapter in part two did make me physically sick. I actually did want to throw up reading it. It was hard to read just because like I I would never call myself an empath. I feel like I have some beef with that term. I feel like it's an entry point for this like alt-right pipeline or whatever. Anyway, I'm not going to expand on that. Point is that I do empathize with a lot of these characters, which surprised me because in the book, Simon J. Kraft is a rapist and a murderer. We don't get to, like, there are some other Links who we do get more details about the crimes that they have committed. So, for example, we do learn that Stax was in prison because she killed one of her teachers while she was in high school because he was trying to rape her. And in my world, that's a very valid reason to kill somebody. She should have gotten a gold medal and a standing ovation, in my opinion. But hey, right? We live in a fucked up world. And again, Adjei-Brenyah takes a moment to kind of give statistics about the amount of prisoners who were imprisoned for defending themselves against violent crimes like rape. But yeah, the to be influenced chapter, his like Simon's pain, the way that it was described, the experience of it was so visceral. It genuinely did turn my stomach. And something that I thought was interesting about it is when Simon he goes to fight Ruiz, which is just another prisoner in this, prison, and like the guards, they're like betting on these prisoners who's going to win and blah, 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 blah. And which does happen in real life, by the way. something that Simon notes, like as we're in his mind, he talks about how Ruiz is moving slower than last time, almost like he's moving in slow motion. It like he describes it as like time is slowing down. And it made me wonder, or at the very like I kind of assumed that that meant like because he had been influenced so many times that it had quite literally altered his nervous system to the point where he was experiencing time differently. And I don't think that's a ridiculous thing to assume, especially later on when we get to Patricia St. John's chapter where she's like talking about her creation of the influencer. So Lawrence, the prison guard for Simon, has used the influencer against him. I think he says 6 times at this point in like a month and a half, 2 months or some a very short amount of time. And we are led to believe that this is far beyond the normal and intended use for the influencer. Like even in terms of crowd control and whatever else, like using it 6 times on one person in a short amount of time is beyond cruel, beyond torturous. And he's clearly being abused by a psycho prison guard on a power trip, which again happens in real life. In part 2, we also see the melee between the Aham chain and the U benders or U blockers or something like that. And one of the U blockers, like because again, the melee is basically two chains coming up against each other while they're marching to their campgrounds, and they have to fight each other until one team manages to kill one opponent. So as soon as one person dies from a team, the melee is over. So we're like getting tense. We're ramping up. We're about to witness this melee, and all of a sudden, one of the U blockers kind of goes on this monologue for a moment. He's like talking about how he had signed up to be part of the CAPE program because he had seen Loretta and had seen how far she rose through the ranks and how close she was to being free, and he was inspired by that. And then when he got into the program and realized what kind of hell it actually was, he realized that there is no escaping it. Whether he spends his 25 years in prison or is in the chain gang sport, it's hell, it's horrible, it's awful. And he feels almost like she had lied to him for some, like, even though, she never personally told him to join the program, he felt like whatever hope he had held out for in joining this program, that he was let down by her. And she does not appreciate that very much. She kind of feels like he was calling her a liar, and she's like kind of offended by this. But he ends up just killing himself and ending the melee before anybody had to fight anybody. Now, something I really just want to dive into really quickly is the dynamic between Thurwar and Stax and Randy Mack. I really loved the queer representation in this novel, obviously between Stax, who is canonically bisexual at least, and then Thurwar, who we believe that she is a lesbian. There's nothing that really ever clearly states that, but they're in a sapphic relationship. And Stax is also in some kind of relationship with Randy Mack. So there is like a polyamorous situation happening over here. And I thought that was a very interesting dynamic, not only to represent polyamory in general, but because the circumstances that they are in, I think, proved to be so unique that a character like Thurwar, who canonically was so jealous that she's literally in prison for murdering the woman that she loved, Vanessa, because of her jealousy. She was so overcome with this jealousy that she ended up murdering Vanessa. And so the level of character growth and just growth in general that it would take for somebody to go from being in prison for murdering someone out of jealousy to allowing, she doesn't own Stax, but to being okay enough to have Stax also be in a romantic relationship with Randy Mack, especially because they are in such close quarters with one another. Thurwar could have easily killed Randy at any point in time, but she didn't, because it was more important to her. She knew that Randy Mack was providing some kind of comfort for Stax that allowed her to get through this horrible, tragic, traumatic experience that they had to go through being in the chain gang sport. And I think that took a tremendous amount of growth for Loretta. And I thought that was a really beautiful to witness, how these awful circumstances could kind of like push a character to grow in a way that she might have never had the opportunity to do had she not joined the sport. Again, I'm not justifying chain gang, okay? I'm just saying that the queer representation, the way that it was written, it felt very unique to me in the sense of like, usually polyamory is not represented in that way. It's kind of like, usually it's either like made fun of, or I liked it. I enjoyed that aspect of it. Okay, so I am going to skip quite a bit ahead because, like I said, in part two, I did not stop to write down my thoughts after every chapter, every other chapter. So we're going to skip ahead to Mitchell's chapter. And he's like part of I can't remember if he's on the board for the Chain Gang Cape program, whatever, or if he's just kind of like a fix it man. But this is the guy that came up with the idea of blood points. And he's also the guy that came up with the idea of making the links wear or have tattooed the crimes that they committed onto their skin so that when they're out on the battleground, the viewers are able to dehumanize these prisoners because they say, oh, like, oh, that guy's a rapist. Oh, that guy murdered 3 people. Oh, that, like they are able to justify and kind of like remove themselves from the violence that they are witnessing and supporting because in their minds, these are prisoners. They deserve it. Fuck them. They committed all these horrible atrocities and crimes. So they deserve every amount of torturous moment that they are experiencing. I think it's very interesting because we do get to see the different sides of like, there is a newscaster who was interviewing Marissa at some point, a little bit prior to Mitchell's chapter. And Marissa is trying to explain why she takes the stand because she's a protester, right? So she's trying to explain her stance of abolition to a woman whose sister was brutally murdered. And obviously the newscaster is like, what about my sister? She's not here. They get to be here. Very like real human questions of like, why did my family member, why did my friend, my close loved one have to be the one to die and to suffer? And like, you think that these people should be out free, allowed to do this stuff? And Marissa's trying to explain like, no, I get that people do horrible things, but like the systems that we have created around it, like I believe that this is the sentiment of abolition, right? Is that we're trying to prevent these types of crimes before they even happen by ensuring that people have access to resources, right? A lot of violent crime would go down if people were able to feed themselves, if people were able to be housed and clothed and educated and have access to healthcare and medicine. A lot of violent crime would go down. And so instead of allocating these resources for private prisons that essentially enslave these prisoners and do not focus on rehabilitation or anything like that, they focus on making it a for-profit system. Instead of doing that, maybe if we just allocated those funds to ensuring that people are housed and fed and educated and all this stuff, then violent crime would drastically go down. There's science to support this. And that's what abolition is really about, is that punitive carceral measures are not ever effective in the prevention of violent crime. Argue with your mother if you disagree. So yeah, in Mitchell's chapter, he's discussing how he's actually the one who came up with the blood points and the dehumanization of the prisoners and blah, blah, blah. And this is where he uses the word ecosystem, that he has set up this ecosystem. He was the mastermind behind it. And this is where I actually paused and I was like, oh, how interesting that Adjei-Brenyah decided to use this word. And this was a conclusion that I had come to earlier on in part 1, because again, bringing that attention back to the idea that if people aren't making money off of it, then they have no reason to put these prisoners through that. If these prisoners aren't going through that, then people have no reason to financially support it. If people aren't financially supporting it, then the people at the top have no reason to do it. It's like this awful cycle of, in some capacity, everybody is participating, again, whether they are willing or not. And I think as a reader, we're meant to question the ways in which we, in our current day, in our real life, in our everyday, in our thought processes, and the way that we engage with one another, how we too might be potentially participating in these systems of violence that keep us down, keep us oppressed, and that cause real harm and violence to other people. So shortly after Mitchell's chapter, this is where like a whole tense moment happens at this farmer's market, and the protesters, who number in the thousands, eventually break through the fence. And now there's this, there is crowd control happening with these militarized police that are fucking throwing tear gas and rubber bullets and shit that they do in real life today for people practicing their right to protest. And in this moment, the protesters, Marissa, Kai, and Niall, and a few of their other friends, have created this like barricade for Stax and Thurwar. They're inside of this barricade that these people have created with their bodies. And this is the moment. This is the first time since Thurwar has gotten the note that she can actually tell Stax what the plan is about season 33, where they're going to be forced to fight each other. And Hamura is crying because she turns to Thurwar and she's like, I have to tell you what happened with Sunset. And that's where the chapter ends. And you're like, fuck. Again, back to this idea of Adjei-Brenyah being able to create. He knows exactly where to leave the reader off, to the point where you don't want to put the book down. You need to know what is going on. So that's exactly what I did. I kept on reading. I was like, what's happening here? And this is where we really learn what Hamura did, what Sunset said about how he does not want forgiveness and how he can't live in the real world after everything. And we also learned that he had learned somehow from Jerry, the van driver, aka Marissa's uncle, that that the plan was to have Stax and Thurwar fight each other. So Sunset knew it. He told Stax. So she knew a long time before Thurwar even did, a couple weeks before. And so this is a moment where we're like, shit. Now they both know it. What are they going to do about it? And this is where part 2 ends. I damn near threw my Kobo across the room. Again, for like the third time reading this book, I wanted to just smash my Kobo onto the ground. Because what the fuck? The intensity that is coming from the crowd, that is coming from the militarized police, the conversation that Thurwar and Loretta are, like, all of this is so tense. My heart was in my throat. Adjei-Brenyah is a very talented writer when it comes to writing these scenes like this. And I loved that all of the action was clear. It was direct. There was no mincing words. You knew exactly what was happening the whole time, where every character was, there was no confusion as to what was happening. You knew good and damn well what was going on. All right, so I'm not gonna lie, like I mentioned earlier in the video, for part 3, I did not write a single note down. The entire script was written after I had already finished the book for part 3. And that's because I could not put the book down. Like I said, I read all of part 3 in one sitting because I needed to know what was going on. My heart was about to give out. It was pounding so hard. I cried when Randy Mack died. I cried when Hendrix Young died. I cried when Simon J. Kraft died. Okay, sue me. Like, this book had me questioning a lot about my own internal biases and thought process in regard to how to treat these violent criminals. Now, I have considered myself an abolitionist for some time. I have tried to do, the readings and kind of like understanding this point of view. But I will admit that I have had, just historically, I've had a difficult time with kind of thinking about how to treat people who do rape people, who do murder people for fun, not in like self-defense or anything like that. But like serial killers and stuff like that. I have always, to some extent, believed that, like, I know punitive action is not as effective as we believe it to be, but I have a really hard time being okay with letting rapists just like not roam free or whatever, but like where do we draw the line, right? For me personally, I don't believe that the state ever has the right to determine who gets to live and who dies. Nor do I think that for-profit prison systems are beneficial for society at all in any capacity. Only for the rich and the powerful. But like I said, when it comes to pedophiles, when it comes to rapists, when it comes to serial killers and stuff like that, I believe in street justice. I don't like, you rape somebody, chain you up, give that person 10 minutes and a baseball bat, and whatever happens happens. Is like, that's where I am coming from. That's so not a good position to take, I guess, but like that's how I feel sometimes, most of the time. But again, going back to this idea, I also believe that if people had access to necessities in life, that violent crime would go down. We would be able to prevent a lot of it. What happens if it does happen, in rare cases that it would happen, because again, human conflict is inevitable, it is natural, it is something that will happen. There is a way to minimize it, and that is by providing resources for everybody. But like the very real question remains of like, what do you do with people who inevitably will engage in these violent acts? And like I said, street justice. I like, and I don't think that's controversial, but whatever. Because again, you go into like, okay, well, how do you prove it in the court of law and blah blah blah. But again, historically, the justice system has failed us more than it has helped us. So what do we do with that? Anyway, like I said, I think one of the biggest points of this book was obviously the critique of the penal system that exists today and the potential for the harm that it could cause theoretically in this dystopian near future. But as it stands, we all know that it doesn't actually serve to better any of these communities, and it only seeks to profit off of the pain and suffering of exploited and marginalized people. Now that that's been said, let's discuss the ending. It absolutely destroyed me. As soon as I finished reading the last page, my jaw was on the floor. I was so stunned. I didn't even like. I didn't even know what to do. I didn't even know what to do. Ending it with Loretta being high freed and Stax having psyched her out, like pretending like she was gonna, like that she was seriously coming at her with the scythe, only to like turn it around and flip it and say psych or whatever at the end, or gotcha, and having Thurwar low free Stax. Because we know that Thurwar never would have swung on Hamura if she had known that Hamura was just joking around. That Stax never intended to actually kill Thurwar, and she wanted Thurwar to be the one who made it to High Freed, who made it, because it's alluded to that after this moment, Thurwar was going to do everything that she could after becoming free to dismantle this evil system. Now, I feel like the ending did make sense. Like, it wasn't like, I didn't see it and be like, why would she do that? It played very well into Stax's personality, into her character. This is very much something that she would do. And so I wasn't surprised necessarily by it. I was heartbroken, to be sure, but not surprised. I will say, one of my only critiques is that the ending did feel a little bit abrupt. To me, it was absolutely a powerful moment. I don't deny that at all. But for me personally, I would have liked maybe a quick epilogue of Thurwar, maybe in like a courtroom or some in the room with all of the board members for the chain gang sport, or something like her and Marissa and Kai like fighting the powers that be. Maybe not, we don't even get a conclusion, we don't get a court ruling or anything like that necessarily, but just like a moment showing that Thurwar kept her promise and that she did try to end this cruel sport. I feel like that it would have given me a moment to emotionally regulate myself a little bit and to like come down off of that heightened tension of Loretta smashing her hammer into Stax's head. But again, that's actually where it does end. That's the moment that it ends on. There is no conclusion after that. We don't get to see how Thurwar processes this moment or anything. It literally ends with her smashing her hammer into Stax's head. I know a lot of people really loved the ending, and it was really powerful. I really wish there had been a quick epilogue just really fast to kind of like tie it all together and make me feel a little bit better about how that all went down, because it crushed me. Now, all this to say that Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah was absolutely phenomenal in my opinion. This was my first 5-star read of the year. This was the 14th book that I have read in 2026, and it was my first 5-star read. If that gives you any indication as to all the crap ass books that I have had to read this year. Not had to read, that I did read that ended up being disappointing. This was not one of them. This was a book that I really, by the end of it, I felt very moved, and it caused me to experience a lot of like a huge emotional roller coaster, as well as just kind of causing me to question a lot of my feelings surrounding, like I said, abolition and the way that we can acquire it, move through it, understand it, and make it a reality. There were so many diverse, complex characters. It had great pacing, fantastic exposition. That it was just enough to ground the reader without burying us in detail, which sometimes a lot of authors do. I feel like it just had the perfect balance of character development, action, and dialogue. And of course, it forced the reader to confront some harsh, ugly truths and realities about the world that we currently live in today. But what did you think of the book? Did you like the ending? Did you think it should have been different? Do you have any thoughts that I didn't touch on in this review? Or did you disagree with anything that I had to say? I mean, I really do want to hear from you guys. Like, at the end of the day, I created this channel to talk about books, and part of talking about books is having a discussion. It means we both talk about it. It's not just me yapping at you. I do really love to know what you guys have to say about the book. So go ahead and let me know down in the comments. Until next time, guys.